The historic Paris Agreement commits us all to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. To avoid the worst impacts, we must hold the rise of global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Achieving this goal will require concerted action to reduce emissions to net zero across all sectors of the economy. The political momentum is growing. Over 30 countries and the European Union have already declared net zero emissions policy goals. Renewables are the backbone of this transformation and could deliver 2/3 of the emission reductions needed whilst generating sustainable growth and creating millions of new jobs. And renewables affordability provides new options to decarbonize challenging sectors such as transport and industry. Renewable electricity will play a critical role, but we also need renewable fuels like green hydrogen and sustainable biomass. Global decarbonization will require strong cooperation across countries and industries. IRENA was created with this agenda in mind. Its global reach, cutting-edge knowledge and inclusive platform can help us achieve our shared goals.
Hello and welcome everyone to an official side event for the 12th Clean Energy Ministerial Meeting. This side event is called Governments and International Think Tanks on Features of Net Zero Scenarios, and it is co-organized by Agora Energiewende, one of the leading international think tanks, and by IRENA, the leading intergovernmental organization supporting countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future. I'm Masami Miketa, Senior Program Officer, leading the work on long-term energy scenarios and energy planning at IRENA, and I'll be serving the Master of Ceremony for today's event. For those of you who might not know, IRENA has been the operating agent for the CEM campaign on long-term energy scenarios for the clean energy transition, or LTS campaign, since 2018. And earlier this year, the campaign has been upgraded to the LTES initiative. The LTES initiative aimed to facilitate the exchange of best practices among the government's planning officers on the effective development and the use of scenarios to support the clean energy transition in the national policy making. The LTS campaign, now initiative, had convened the government planning officers and experts around the world over 30 different forums. Today, IRENA partners with Agora Energiewende, who manages the network of international think tanks, which is an equivalent of the LTS network in the NGO sector. In this side event, we will tackle the question, what are the critical features of the global energy transition which national scenario planning should take into account? Long-term energy scenarios can inform policymakers on the alternative pathways and implications of net zero commitments. This question of critical features of transition is of interest to many governments as net zero emission targets are increasingly mainstream in the political agenda around the world, and we have seen political commitments toward carbon neutrality from various national and regional governments in recent months. So today we have two panel sessions. The first one features members of LTS initiative representing the government perspective. And the second panel features the views from the international think tanks. Now, I would like to introduce the first session. It will start with the scene-setting presentation by Dolph Gielen, who is the director of IRENA's Innovation and Technology Center. And following that, Jesse Scott, director of international programs at Agora Energiewende, will moderate a panel discussion with government representatives. We have two excellent panelists from Brazil and the United Kingdom. From Brazil, we have Mr. Tiago Varela, President of the Energy Research Office, which is known as EPE. From the UK government, we have Mr. Jeremy Allen, head of the Energy Portfolio Office, Department for the Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategies, also known as BASE. Without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Dov for his scene-setting presentation. Over to you, Dov.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sami. What I want to do in my scene-setting remarks is talk a little bit about the insights from the IRENA World Energy Transition Outlook. I have prepared a few slides on that topic, and if we move to the next slide. So the World Energy Transition Outlook was launched at the time of the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue in March of this year. And it's for the first time that IRENA issued a 1.5-degree scenario. And for such scenario, global CO2 emissions need to drop to net zero by 2050. And what we find is that renewables, energy efficiency, and electrification are really the three key elements to make that energy transition happen, and also that electricity becomes a key energy carrier. And at the same time, the importance of fossil fuels on the supply side declines significantly. These are significant changes, but we find that there is a strong economic case for such transition. These are findings that are also let's say, reconfirmed by the earlier report of the IPCC, the special report on 1.5 degrees. And in May of this year, the IEA also issued their own net zero scenario, which also has results which are very close to the IRENA findings. If we move to the next slide. So we used a model-based scenario approach for this exercise, and we assessed what will happen with policies in place, what will happen with planned scenarios, and what is the normative scenario, where do we need to go. And that's the orange line, the yellow line, and the blue line in this graph. So you see we need a dramatic acceleration of policies if we want to achieve this 1.5 degree perspective, and we need a more or less continuous reduction of CO2 emissions over time between now and 2050. Go to the next slide. So how can we achieve that? We find that renewables really have a key role to play, and that is in different forms. So of course, renewable power is critical, not only in our scenario, but in all scenarios that are out there. The power sector will be dominated by renewables going forward. We need much higher efficiency of energy use, and the electrification can play a key role in that. So an electric vehicle is 2 to 3 times as efficient as an internal combustion engine car. And also you see that, for example, hydrogen, especially green hydrogen, plays a key role. So overall, about 90% of the emission mitigation has some kind of renewables angle to it. Next one, please. So because renewables play such a key role on the supply side, the role of fossil fuels declines. And up to 2030, it's really critical that the use of coal is reduced. Longer term, you see that also oil use declines significantly, but there is still some natural gas use left in 2050 in this scenario. But of course, these are dramatic changes on the supply side. And then in the next slide, if you look at the demand side, what we see there is that the yellow area increases significantly from 2018 to 2050, and the yellow area, that is the direct use of electricity. So electric vehicles, heat pumps, etc. But you also see that the 2 green areas increase. So we see a significant role also for modern biomass and we see a significant role for hydrogen, clean hydrogen, in this energy transition. And the overall energy use is even slightly lower than what it is today. So the numbers I showed you are mainly focused on 2050. Of course, the main challenge in this transition is the rapid ramp up that we need up to 2030. So that is another aspect where models can help to identify what type of growth rate would we need to get there. For example, we find that the capacity additions for renewables need to increase fourfold in the coming 10 years. Is a massive increase. The models also help to see the link between the supply side and the demand side. So if we need a lot of electric vehicles, a lot of green hydrogen, that means we need to increase the production of electricity also threefold. So it's important to understand these linkages, or the linkage, how, if you have a limited amount of biomass available, how to best use that biomass. So of course, this is one scenario. As I said, I mean, there are other scenarios out there that reconfirm many of the findings, but there are also some differences. We need to understand these differences, where they come from. Is it really a modeling result, or is it an input assumption? And what does it then mean for the policy strategies that we need to put in place to make this transition happen? So that is a very important discussion we want to pick up in the context of the new long-term energy scenarios initiative. Also, we find that the stakeholders for this type of information are changing. We're getting now a lot more questions also, for example, from the financing sector and from ministries of finance. So there's a lot more interest for what are now the implications for investments and for financing needs. And of course, models can also help to identify these. So that's my initial remarks for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dolf. Thank you to the Clean Energy Ministerial for this invitation to Agora. We're pleased to join and support in partnership with IRENA and also with the International Network of Energy Transition Think Tanks, some members of which will be presenting in session 2. Let's bring on stage Tiago and Jeremy for our first panel discussion. Tiago, Jeremy, hello, and thank you for joining.
Pleasure to be
here. We have here, of course, representatives of 2 key countries in the global effort and the global outcomes for net zero. So also 2 countries with very different energy histories as they start the transition towards this shared goal. So perhaps I'd like to ask you to start by saying a little about the starting points in each country. As you look at the global energy transition, what for you are the most critical features to be accounted for in your national scenario planning to achieve net zero? Tiago, perhaps I look to you first, and the case of Brazil.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks to IRENA, Sam, and all the LTS member countries and the team. Thanks for having me. Well, it's very interesting, this question, because at first we must understand that global scenarios will not fully capture the response that countries and regions will have beyond, as they look into the costs and benefits of the global energy transition. And that is a dynamic process, at the same time cooperative and competitive. So countries will continuously respond and adapt to other countries' strategies, either as a group, a region, or individually. So this is a very dynamic process of responding, and global scenarios will set a scene for a discussion on these costs and benefits, the next steps, which technologies are needed or not at first time. So it will set a reference for the effort needed globally, and maybe some shares of responsibility around the world as well. But of course, when you go to a national level, that is, that has many implications, because countries and regions will have different resources, energy resources, will have different income structures, will have different urban infrastructure. So many issues will have to be addressed locally. Of course, some countries will be tempted to promote technology lock-ins because, and shape markets because of the economic and geopolitical interests and issues. Of course, that's absolutely expected in the process. And also supply and demand growth or decrease of different energy sources or carriers will evolve and need some level of coordination that is both on a domestic level, but also will have to respond to a global dynamic. So in the case of Brazil, we have a starting point which is very interesting, because in 2020, we are basically 50% renewable already. So that's a very interesting starting point for the country. And it proves that renewable energy can be very competitive in the country with fossil fuels. But it also means that going beyond 50% requires, and we have 85% renewable energy in the electricity grid. So it means that going beyond that will obviously be different than other countries or regions that are starting from 15, 20% renewable. So going beyond 85% renewable in the electricity grid is really challenging because of all the flexibility issues and so on. And going beyond the current levels of renewability in the transport and industry will also be challenging because of the new technologies, new fuels, and the green premium that is still required today. And as an emerging economy, as an emerging country with a lot of inequalities, it's really a political issue how to share those costs and also those benefits. So I would start by stating these concerns and issues.
Okay, so the challenge, and you sound excited about the challenge while also recognizing many of its difficult elements. Jeremy, in the UK, I think there's been a long-term perspective. The UK has been running carbon budgets for a number of years. What is the UK perspective, just to open this discussion?
Thanks. So where we find ourselves in 2021, I mean, if we look back, we see a history of the transition away from a predominantly fossil fuel-based power system, coal and gas, the introduction of nuclear, and then over the last 15 to 20 years, the increasingly rapid deployment of renewables, so that in 2021, we find ourselves with low carbon sources, somewhere around 50% or so of our power mix. We anticipate the very quick removal of the final elements of coal by the middle of the 2020s. We won't have any coal on the system, but we still will have a need for gas, and understanding the transition away from unabated gas is something that we will obviously have to think about. As we look forward and take a strategic perspective over the next 30 years out to 2050, and our national goal to be net zero emissions across the economy in 2050. A lot of what Dolph said in his presentation resonates with us. I think we would certainly agree that electricity is going to play a critical role in the transition to net zero, both within the power sector, but also because it is a vector for decarbonising heat, transport, and will be critical in those sectors too to reduce emissions. Sectors which are even more reliant currently on fossil fuels than power. For us, the challenge is we we need to think about how we deploy technologies, particularly renewables, but how do we do that retaining a sense of whole system approach, one that is not just about reducing emissions, as critical as that is, but where you maintain system operability and high levels of security of supply alongside massive reductions in emissions, and you think about the affordability of power to those who will pay for it, consumers. We need to think about what are our technology choices as we look to the next 30 years and recognize that right now in 2021, we don't know all the technology solutions that might become available to us over time. So how do we plan for what we can deploy today, which is commercially deployable? How do we anticipate and plan for options that are still on the drawing board, which are just being conceived and are in a pre-commercial stage? And then how do we think about not just the infrastructure, the power generation capacity, but the system and the critical enablers to make that a system, whether that's the network reforms, the reforms of markets that make it a system that infrastructure drops into and operates as a system that's efficient and performs the function we need electricity to do. So those are the things very much on our minds. We look also that we're going to have to do this against rising demand in the UK because we will be using electricity in other sectors. So how do we do how do we reduce emissions, retain reliability and affordable power, but in a scenario of potentially very significant increases in demand? That's where we're thinking, and that's where we're positioning ourselves as we look forward.
Mm-hmm. So I think we have here 4 elements. The question in the context of net zero, the very clear question of emissions budgets. We're using the term long term here, but of course, really to 2050, that's rather a medium term in terms of energy systems. 3 decades is not very long. We have the question of the technologies and working with the technologies we know we have today and the technologies which we think are coming online, but still need some scaling up, some cost discovery. We have the question of the infrastructure investments in order to enable these new technologies to operate and deliver that emissions budget. And as Tiago flagged, but I think also is implied in your remarks, Jeremy, the economic impacts and I hope economic opportunities associated with this. Now, in the global work today, there is a lot of focus on that net zero emissions budget and working back from it. Jeremy, can you say a few words about the UK's experience with budgeting and the UK Climate Change Committee and what that has meant for energy scenarios?
So I think the key is that they are scenarios and they're not predictions of the future. As you say, we have an expert independent body, the Committee on Climate Change, which advises government, and we, as you may know, Jesse, we recently accepted their advice on setting our carbon budget for the mid-2030s, and we're now working out how we deliver that budget. We will have more to say through the course of this year. I think our forward analysis is very resonant of what Dolph presented to us. When we look at our own scenarios around the electricity mix in 2050, we see a system that is predominantly renewables. But in our case, we believe that having a mix of technologies, which currently would be nuclear and power CCUS, reduces system costs, and allows you to go more deeply into decarbonisation. If you then add hydrogen into that, some clean hydrogen, where that's sourced, but low carbon hydrogen. If you enter hydrogen into that mix, you get lower costs and deeper decarbonisation again. So that's what we're thinking about. Now we have some some targets. So, for instance, in the very immediate term, a government is focusing on 40 gigawatts of offshore wind installed by 2030. Longer term, as we set out in our recent energy white paper, we look to maybe to markets to optimize the amount of capacity of particular technologies. We think that's more efficient than setting a series of targets. That said, we think that predominantly we'll be looking at renewables. That's going to be wind and solar predominantly, but could be other forms of renewables. But we see critical roles for nuclear, critical roles for CCUS, and indeed hydrogen as we can bring it on. The interesting thing, as I said, is how you continue to update that scenario thinking as you see new technologies come forward. And particularly, that could be generation technologies. In the UK, we're exploring not just gigawatt scale nuclear, but smaller scales, small modular reactors and other technologies. There could be other forms of renewables that might very cost-effective ways of providing power. We're also, and this touches on Dolph's analysis, very focused on flexibility. So how do you integrate intermittent generation into a system that obviously has to always provide power? What's the flexibility that smoothly integrates renewables into that system? Storage, for us, more interconnection with the continental Europe. How do you shift demand around, and how do you promote efficiency into that system alongside bringing forward generation capacity? That's when we look forward in our scenarios. That's what we're focused on, acknowledging and preparing for a predominantly renewable system, but with other tech, and then managing the demand side through flexibility and energy efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, you mentioned in that some fairly clear factors to 2035 in terms of the emissions budget position in the UK, and some elements of technology with more of a 2030 perspective. Tiago, in Brazil, as you do scenarios thinking in the national context, what are some elements that are becoming clear for 2030, for say the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And just before I go into answering this question, just a brief follow-up comment on something that you both mentioned about the role of innovation and research and new technologies that need to be developed or put into the market. It's also when we're talking about global and regional and local context, it's also interesting to note that technologies will always have to be adapted or developed to be functional in the local context. So it's not just about, for example, having green hydrogen technology. You will also need to develop and innovate to make it functional in the local conditions. And just one example of that, digitalization, grid digitalization. There are many, this is it can be used in many ways, but for tackling commercial losses in grids, in emerging economies and large cities, you need some level of innovation to address those specific problems. The same for biotechnology from sugarcane. That is the case of Brazil. 19% of our energy mix comes from biomass from sugarcane. So it requires level of adaptation and innovation on a local level. And it's something that is not easy to model when you're looking globally, but it's something that will be really important when having scenarios with a regional and local perspective. Now, going into your question, Jess, the NDCs, of course, now are focusing on 2025, 2030. So when you look in this time horizon, you will need to be talking about implemented policies already, or policies that are under implementation to deliver the more immediate results. When we look at the case of Brazil, for example, we have the RenovaBio, the national biofuels policy, with targets to reduce year by year carbon emissions in the transport sector. and we also have the power sector modernization agenda, also looking into the next 10 years to deliver results in the shorter term. But we also need to have the net zero scenarios, because otherwise we'll reach 2030 our targets, and then what's next? And we have not developed or prepared all the technologies, the policies, research that is needed so that we are not stuck in the levels that we are targeting by 2030. So both time horizons are important. And when we look at the carbon neutrality announced by the Brazilian government, we are now currently developing two main responses to that, which is the national hydrogen program, looking into not into delivering huge decarbonization by 2030 by means of low carbon hydrogen, but developing the technology, the regulatory framework, market structure, so that as we move after 2030, we will be in solid conditions to deliver the results. The same for the Fuels of the Future program, also looking into new sustainable fuels and developing a market structure for that. So that's our approach. We have both policies to address 2030, but we are also focusing on preparing the ground for not being stuck as we reach our targets in 2030.
And in terms of preparing the ground, you've mentioned infrastructure. You've mentioned grids and the opportunity to digitalize grids, in particular to manage energy losses, and with that to deliver efficiency gains, a very important part of the puzzle. You've also mentioned hydrogen. What are the implications of hydrogen as an opportunity, and the implications more broadly of the climate neutrality goal in terms of infrastructure in the scenarios that you're looking at? Because infrastructure, as we know, takes many years to build.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. If we look at the infrastructure in our cities, for example, in the large cities, medium-sized cities, and you talk about electrification, digitalization, you talk about access to modern energy, so huge challenges there. And not only the infrastructure itself, but when you also look and model globally these scenarios, you tend to follow the average income structure, the average characteristics or features of the technology and the economy. But when you look into more detail in countries, large countries and complex countries like those in Latin America, you will realize this huge inequality, income inequality, huge regional inequalities. For example, look at the Amazon region and compare it to the São Paulo city. So infrastructure will vary a lot, as well as these challenges. And when you model these inequalities in your energy scenarios, then you realize that, for example, deploying electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, will be a challenge when you're looking into the broader picture of such countries. When deploying the rollout of smart meters, all of that will have regional and some different paces of development. So when you talk about infrastructure, I tend to bring all the other policy objectives, because we're not just talking about climate goals. We are also talking about industrial development policies, tax policies, research policies, agriculture policies, urban development policies. So we have multiple objectives, and it's really challenging to kind of address all of them at the same time, and they tend to be inconsistent many times. So what we see as a role for energy scenarios is try to provide evidence of those inconsistencies. So if you put money here, then and you put money here, then and you provide tax incentives for other things, then the result will not be possibly the best. And communicating that to the society and is also really challenging. So bringing the issue of infrastructure is quite also brings many other complexities. But I think huge investment, a lot of financing, and that's part of the challenge, right?
I like very much your thought about the challenge of the inconsistencies. Remember the OECD report from, I believe, 2015 about the alignment, or rather the misalignment, of many policies with climate objectives. And we still face this challenge in a lot of the scenario work today. I want to pick up on one element of that, where we have a sort of a macroeconomic set of assumptions and a set of climate and energy assumptions. And that's the question of energy demand. And that's because that's very different as an element for your scenarios in your two countries. Jeremy, you've mentioned that there will be demand growth from the electricity sector. Now, in the UK context, correct me if I'm incorrect, that's in the context of essentially flat overall energy demand. That's a demand shift to electricity from other energy vectors. Tiago, in Brazil, of course, we have an emerging economy with rapid growth, with many social goals in that rapid growth, considerable population growth, and it'd be interesting to hear about some of your energy demand assumptions for the next 30 years. Perhaps Jeremy first on this question. What are the certainties and the uncertainties of energy demand as you look at scenarios which respect efficiency, climate goals, and other elements of economic strategy?
Yeah, I think you're right. In the UK context, where we see demand is growing is for electricity, but that offsets demand in other sectors for other forms of energy, fossil fuels. So I think when we project forward, you see this kind of very decisive shift away from fossil fuels by 2050. So it's almost gone from our energy mix, but within a total of flat or lower overall demand, but with that challenge within that you are in our context potentially doubling demand for power, and that's I think where we're focusing our thoughts, which is okay. So we need that infrastructure to be net zero consistent, so very, very low emissions, perform its function as a power system against rising demand, against the retirement of plant that we can foresee. So we have scheduled now the complete removal of coal in the next couple of years. Now that at the moment is at the margins, it's not providing a lot of power, but we will see our current nuclear fleet begin to retire over the next 10 years, all but one of the current fleet is likely to have retired over the next 10 years or so. We are building new nuclear in the form of Hinkley Point C, and we've announced that we'll begin a negotiation about a further gigawatt scale plant. See where that leads to. So we've got all these. We've got increased demand, low emissions, retiring capacity that needs to be replaced, and bring forward new plant that has certain characteristics. Fitting all that together is the big challenge, but it comes in the context of we're displacing and fossil fuels in transport and in heating. We do need to think very much about promoting greater efficiency, and so on the demand side, we have challenges in the UK context around the building stock, how new build is fully energy efficient, how we retrofit and improve the existing stock of housing or industrial business premises, so that we are helping to reduce demand. That's critical for helping consumers manage their bills, that they are using less energy and therefore their bills have an impact on that lower demand. So there's a big challenge about that. And then I would echo Tiago's thoughts that you can be far more efficient in the managing of your electricity system through smart technologies, through the digitalization of the system that really optimizes supply and demand in a very smart way, shifts demand around the system different periods of the day, all of which helps to negate necessarily the need for more and more capacity, more and more networks. If you're clever about managing demand, you can do a lot, and maybe you get to the point where you don't have to consider the nth power plant, because you're actually optimizing demand against the existing supply in a far more intelligent way.
Thank you. Tiago, energy demand in the Brazilian scenario context.
Well, actually projecting economic growth in Brazil has been like riding a roller coaster in the past years, because we have seen, huge growth followed by stagnation, now the COVID pandemic, and a number of macro and microeconomic reforms. So it's a real challenge projecting future economic growth. So when uncertainty is high, then scenarios are the way to support decision making, right? Because you will not make the decisions based on one single trajectory. You will assess a number of possibilities and try to minimize your regrets when deciding. So that's how we do it. So, for example, when talking about the 2050 energy plan approved by the Ministry of Energy last December, we developed it based on two main scenarios. One is what we call the challenging scenario, in which we see a huge demand growth, economic growth and demand, and energy demand growth. And the second main scenario, which was the stagnation, where energy per capita is basically the same along the time period. So that provides you a range of possibilities to kind of to have an idea or where you can go in the next years, in the coming years. And in our 10-year plans, we have one reference scenario in terms of economy, and two additional scenarios, one superior and inferior scenarios. And we try to make sensibility studies to provide information for policymakers to kind of prevent regrets if you plan for lower demand and then economy speeds up, then you might have some huge regrets. So that's our basic approach to economic growth. It's continuous work, of course, and one thing that is important is also that when we are addressing supply and demand structural balance, then when we have, for example, 50%, almost 50% renewability in the mix, renewable energy comes with variability. And so you will need to also address not only demand growth and behavior, but also adapt your models to address the variability which is natural to renewability. And for example, in the past 7 years, we've had below average water in our hydropower systems. And actually, in the past 6 months, the worst hydrology in let's say 90 years, according to our numbers. So this is also a challenge when you have to address both demand and supply, and the more renewability you have, the more challenging it becomes.
Thank you. I think our panel is drawing to a close, so I wanted to just pull out 5 or 6 very short points that both of you have made, which I think indicate that the two countries and the two governments are both, in fact, thinking of the role of long-term energy scenarios in a similar way, despite the different contexts. Firstly, that these help provide a clear goal. Secondly, that they help support government decision-making. They indicate no regrets. They indicate risk management. I take the point about the hydropower supply in Brazil as a key example of this. And that they highlight questions of wider policy consistency, and that is also a very important task of a scenario exercise. It's not that there is full visibility 30 years ahead in either context, but there is an ability to identify key questions, options, and milestones. And this, I think, we'll be returning to in the next panel. At this point, I will hand back to Asami and say thank you very much, Tiago and Jeremy. Very interesting discussion.
Pleasure, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tiago and Jeremy, for sharing your experience and views with us. And thanks, Jesse, for the excellent moderation. Now, we will move to the next session, focusing on the perspectives from the international think tanks. And Jesse will stay with us to give the scene-setting presentation, and after that, Dolph will moderate the session with the representatives from international think tanks. We have the pleasure of having three renowned think tanks from Japan, Indonesia, and South Africa. From Japan, we have Mika Obayashi, Director at the Renewable Energy Institute. From Indonesia, we have Fabi Tumiwa, Executive Director of Institute for Essential Service Reform. And from South Africa, we have Bruce Lowe, Chief Strategy Officer of Green Cape. So you will meet them after the scene setting presentation by Jesse. So Jesse, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Asami. And I think I have some slides to load. Thank you very much. So for this scene setting, what I thought I would do is outline a little bit the contribution of the NGOs to this discussion we've heard from the government side, and explain how NGOs, in particular think tanks, so working in the analytic space as NGOs, are contributing to the discussion on scenarios that will deliver net zero. What we do as this group of NGOs, including Agora Energiewende and the partner think tanks who will be discussing in the panel, is try to proactively develop analysis in advance of key policy decisions, to feed the debate, to establish a useful fact base into the debate, and ultimately to try to accelerate those policy decisions. We also try to grow, in doing this process, spend a lot of time listening to the different stakeholders in the discussion and creating a dialogue space where the stakeholders can share their questions and where policy ideas can be stress tested as an advance to the formal policy process led, obviously, in government. And it's very important that in this process, it is the national think tanks with their local know-how and also local legitimacy on this issue who lead the way. If I could have my next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the objective is equally clear for the NGOs. We are looking at the net zero target, and this means goals to 2050 on carbon and goals to 2070 on greenhouse gases. And it requires all countries to adopt a course towards this, with perhaps slightly different timelines from the mature economies and the emerging economies. To my next slide. Here are examples from the 4 think tanks participating here today, which are part of a wider network with around 20 member think tanks with specialist programs, or indeed entire teams, working on energy transition. We have an example of a report which we presented from Japan on renewable pathways to climate neutral Japan, a report from Indonesia, again on the renewable-based decarbonization pathway, from South Africa, where Green Cape are contributing to South Africa's development of a renewable energy master plan, and from Germany, where our colleagues have recently published a climate neutral Germany study. If I may say a word about the German study, since the others will be presented by their lead authors and experts. This study, which was published in April this year, is perhaps an example of how think tanks can contribute. The study looked at 3 steps to achieve climate neutrality, net zero, by 2045, setting out also milestones for 2030 in order to set the right course for the transition to succeed, including a coal phase out in energy and industry, reaching around 70% of renewable generation, decarbonization of the district heating system, and use of hydrogen in the energy sector and industry, and electrification in transport and heating. That study was launched actually at roughly the same moment that the German Federal Constitutional Court was considering the climate action brought by the young activists, a decision which has just been published, which ruled that the current action in Germany is insufficient to deliver on goals and ultimately therefore harms future generations' opportunities and civil liberties by postponing the decarbonization process. That Constitutional Court ruling has led to more ambitious policy proposals by the government, which in fact are a very close outcome to what Agora was modeling and publishing. Those main milestones see Germany now moving towards something like a reduction in emissions of around 65% by 2030 and around 88% on the 1990 baseline by 2040. These are really quite ambitious goals, and it's certainly launched a new stage of the policy debate in Germany. So this is the kind of work that the think tanks like to undertake. If I could move to the next slide. Here is a slide from the German study showing the important focus on the 2030 action points. And the next slide, which gives us a focus on some of the ways that these key milestones work out. Clearly, the overall targets are an element for that scenario process. Then really coal, renewables, electrification, carbon-free investment, and green synthetic fuels, in particular the hydrogen, are the other essential building blocks around which it's been possible to develop this study and come to some very clear conclusions. That then creates some 2030 actions. And here we have an overall summary of some of the ones that you see in the industrial mature countries from an economic perspective and some of the emerging economy steps. Now, as a network of think tanks, we're able to bring together the different national studies and make these sorts of comparisons towards a global level. And that's very interesting to inform our dialogue with national governments and also engagement with the international process intergovernmentally. And to my last slide. Thank you very much. I want to emphasize here as we go into the panel debate that, of course, there has been a great increase in thought processes about hydrogen in particular in the last years. Really, this is implied by the net zero objective. And one of the things we found it very helpful to do as think tanks is to clarify really which uses for indirect electrification, that is, the synthetic electric fuels, are uncontroversial and which may vary depending on the particular circumstances of the country's energy infrastructure, assets and objectives, and where really this seems an inefficient choice to make pretty much in any national context. There's a clear role for these fuels to support high temperature processes in industry, to support the heavy and the long distance elements of transport, to be a storage factor for variable renewable energy backup in the power sector, and support certain kinds of large-scale spatial heating. High temperature heat more broadly depends a little bit on the particular energy country. Transport, when you go to some of the lighter and shorter distances, becomes more of a question. And in the power sector, the absolute size of the need for hydrogen, given the other flexibility and storage options, is a really challenging and interesting question at this time, and my colleagues will say something to that. Generally, our findings and the findings of the colleagues indicate that the role of hydrogen for low temperature heat is perhaps not efficient, and likewise for small-scale private transport and in individual buildings as a solution to low temperature space heating. I think that completes my presentation, and the time is up also. Thank you very much. So I turn back to the panelists for session 2.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jesse. That was a fascinating overview of the situation here in Germany. We have 3 excellent panelists, Mika, Bruce, and Fabi. Thank you very much for joining. And we will dive immediately into the discussion. We wanted to start with the first question around what are the main energy transition strategies that emerge from the long-term energy scenarios, and how do those scenarios influence policymaking and the public discourse in your national context? And Mika, may I ask you to start?
Thank you very much for Irina and Agora for organizing this event and included me in the discussion. It is quite interesting timing. At this very moment, Japan is debating the long-term scenario for 2050 and the energy mix for 2030, and we are watching carefully what will emerge in next 2 weeks. 90% of Japan's greenhouse gas emissions are CO2, and more than 90% of CO2 are from energy sector. Energy transition is the policy for climate action for Japan, but we do not have a regulation to limit total emissions, nor do not have an effective carbon pricing system, so coal remains the cheapest energy source in Japan. The debate on how to curb total emissions with energy transition is a new concept. The accident at TEPCO's Fukushima Daiichi a decade ago triggered a full-scale debate on the energy transition, which is progressing slowly but surely. The most important 2 measures have been taken are power sector reform with the unbundling of generation of transmission, the liberalization of retail market, and certainly the feed-in tariff introduction for renewables. Japan's electricity mix last year was 31% coal, 34% natural gas, with 4% oil generation remaining, while renewables have increased to 22% of the total. Now, on some days, renewables account for more than 50% of Japan's electricity supply, and wholesale electricity prices are getting cheaper. The challenge is not only promoting renewables, but how we can rapidly phase out fossil fuels, especially coal-fired power. After Paris Agreement enforcement, progressive business started to call for the government to take proactive climate action. As a think tank, in 2018, we established the Japan Climate Initiative with CDP Japan and WWF Japan to support business sector's climate actions and advocacy. This network has grown to attract more than 650 businesses and organizations, including large corporations such as Sony, Hitachi, SoftBank, Suntory, and more others. Recently, they have put out adverts calling on the government to set ambitious renewable target for 2030 and NGCs of 45% to 50% GHG reduction. But behind these calls is a scientific analysis that we have done in scenarios and presented as figures that businesses can be confident in promoting. Prime Minister Suga made a 2050 carbon neutral declaration in October last year, which had a huge impact on industry's policy. Earlier this year, the Iron and Steel Federation announced new target to decarbonize the industry by 2050, 50 years earlier than the previous target of 2100. And on 22nd April this year, Prime Minister also announced a 46% reduction as NDC for 2030. These new policies are largely politically driven, unlike the previous target, which were the result of negotiations between ministries and industries and the accumulation of figures. The ministries are now under reviewing long-term strategies and approach to the 2030 energy mix, we Renewable Energy Institute have some opportunities to present to government councils about our studies, as well as the 2050 long-term scenario. It was the first time that a non-industrial, non-governmental think tank had the opportunity to participate in this discussion. Our 2050 scenario study is a collaboration with Agora Energiewende and Lappeenranta University in Finland, which shows, if I may, for the first time in Japan that the full-scale decarbonization with almost 100% renewable is realistically possible, and that the future based on renewable is economically feasible rather than continuing to rely on conventional energies. 100% renewables electricity sector, which will be integrated with other sectors, and hydrogen from renewables will be used in some heavy industry and heavy-duty transport sectors that cannot be electrified, but not all of green hydrogen will be produced domestically. Interconnectors with other countries will be built to ensure efficient and flexible use of renewable electricity. In order to achieve this, it is necessary to eliminate the current market barriers to renewables, introduce carbon pricing and other measures, and create an environment where renewables are introduced cheaply and in large quantities. But in this way, Japan will be able to decarbonize its economy, halve its total energy demand, and reduce the cost of the whole system. Our scenario was met with a split response in the government panel, with some supporting it and others arguing that it is not feasible. We have presented the study for numerous times in last 5 months at meetings and subcommittees of both the ruling and opposition parties at the parliament, in debate organized by our business federation, meetings of NGOs and consumers groups. The scenario stimulates ongoing debate on the 2030 energy mix and 2050 long-term targets. We continue to evoke the discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mika, for that comprehensive overview. I mean, the discussion in Japan is very interesting, and the role that scenarios play in that. I would like to move to South Africa, which is also a very interesting economy because it's, of course, at the moment largely coal-based. So energy transition has huge implications there. Bruce, can you elaborate for us what is the role of scenarios in that discussion about a transition?
Right, thank you, Dov. So as you mentioned, South Africa, very heavily coal-based economy at the current point, with coal not just being used as a primary source of energy for our electricity sector, but also primary fuel source for both liquid fuels as well as process heat. So we use coal in a number of different aspects in our economy, creating a very high emissions case. So the current planning and policy scenarios aim for our coal fleets to effectively reach their end of life over the next 10 to 20 years, depending on the coal fleet, some retiring as early as next year in the planning. And all of our current planning suggests that these plants will be replaced by renewable energy plants. So the primary discussion going on in South Africa at the moment around the just transition is really around how do we ensure that we have a just energy transition, making sure we don't lose the jobs and employment that the coal sector currently has in place. So one of the key pieces of work we're doing in terms of making sure that the policy stays aligned with where it is actually around a renewable energy master plan, as mentioned by Jesse earlier, which aims to build an industrialization base and to show the value of renewable energy industry, both in terms of building the renewable energy plants themselves and their construction, operation, and all of their balance of plant, as well as the potential for localization of some of the larger components within the sector, such as towers and blades, that make more sense to manufacture locally than to transport these large components. And so the goal there of that study is really to show how the decommissioning of coal doesn't provide a major threat to the current employment numbers and those that are employed in the coal sector. So in the South African case, it's really trying to avoid the competing scenario, I guess, in terms of a pathway forward is refiring and repowering of coal stations extending their life. And the coal life extension is really the worst case scenario in terms of reaching a net zero space, because that dramatically pushes out the timelines by which it would take for South Africa to reach a net zero space. So our work is primarily trying to show that there is no need to do that. A lot of the policy modeling and adjusting of the policy decision has been fairly successful, in part showing that renewable energy is in fact the cheapest option for South Africa in terms of new build energy. So that's been very successful in designing the plans. Now we're at a point where implementing the plans becomes more important than adjusting them. So the plans are not perfect. They still don't hit everything that has been modeled and pushed by the various think tanks pushing information into the sector. But they're very positive and a very good step forward for the country and sort of on the right track. But they're being threatened at the moment by the employment issues and general economic conditions that might cause South Africa not to as closely follow what is actually a very ambitious plan with a renewable energy infrastructure build that would be the largest single infrastructure project that South Africa has embarked in the last 20 years. So it really is a fantastic set of planning documents that we have in place at the moment, and we're really trying to make sure that the implementation of those plans is not stumbled at this point.
Thank you very much. And we see the same type of questions in IRENA. So more and more member countries come and say, well, what are the socioeconomic impacts? Can you prove that there is indeed a benefit? So that is clearly a frontier in scenario and modeling at the moment. I want to move to the Indonesia case. Southeast Asia is seen as a key region in the global climate debate. And Indonesia, as the largest economy in the region, is of special importance. What is the discussion in Indonesia, and what role do scenarios play in that discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Dolph. I think similar to South Africa, Indonesia also depends on coal for electricity generation. Around 60% to 65% of the electricity come from coal. And recently, the government also plans to increase coal utilization to replace LPG, import LPG. So we've seen that the plan actually moved to coal. Although recently the government has released the long-term strategy, and the current discussion that in the country is that Indonesia will reach net zero emission by 2060 or sooner, with the emission will peak by 2030. That this actually still with that you see that a number of thermal power in terms of coal and natural gas in the pipeline, in the system, with carbon neutral technology like CCS. So it's still there is a number of that in the current scenario by government. And unlike government's scenario, we in ISR actually have come up with these different pathways that we look at the possibilities to reach deep decarbonizations by 2050 with 100% renewables. Our study shows that it is technically and economically viable to reach zero emission for the energy system based on 100% renewables by 2050. So it's earlier than what the government targets are. And with under this scenario, we are looking at incremental deployment of renewable energy, mainly solar, and the moratorium of coal power, and then phasing out of coal-fired power plants. So those are the key features of our decarbonization. So we actually looking at a 3-stage of this. So the first stage, from now until 2030, that we also envisions that the emission will peak by 2030, before then decline toward zero emission by 2050. So in this first stage, the 2020 to 2030, that the number of renewable energy has to increase dramatically from current level. But at the same time, there should be no new coal-fired plant built, and even there should be initial coal phase out, especially coal that already reached more than 30 years old. From 2030 to 2045, that's actually the big chunk where the remaining coal-fired power plant has to be phased out from the system. And at the same time, then we even increase more renewable energy and start to decarbonize the industry and transport. And after 2045 to 2050, it's remaining decarbonization of the difficult sectors like transport and industry, where we introduce the green hydrogen into the system. And I think that's kind of the pathways that we are actually looking. It's very, very important in our scenario is that the coal has to be stopped. And I think that's a bit political. It needs political decision from the government, because if you look at the current or existing national energy policies, it still contain coal still play a big role in our energy system, and that actually against the effort to meet Paris Agreement or to reach, in this case, net zero or zero emission by 2050.
Indeed. So all three of you say that renewable, especially renewable power, is critical, and coal should be phased out. So this is the critical component in all three countries. But if we now look broader at technologies and what models tell us about technologies, Mika, if we take the Japanese policy, Japan has a very interesting discussion about nuclear. There is still a focus also on CCS, and there is also a focus on hydrogen cars, for example. Three remarkable characteristics of the policy. So what does your modeling and scenarios tell, and what kind of discussions do you have around such technology solutions?
Yeah, I believe the world's approach to climate action over the past 30 years and the global energy transition of the past decade have clearly shown that the direction of technology that we need to implement. And Japan is not the exemption from that direction. Firstly, in supply and demand, renewables and energy efficiency. Secondly, energy storage and grid technologies to provide flexibility. And thirdly, the digital transformation that underpins it. Almost all of these are technologies that we already have, not technology that will be developed in the next 20 years. It is important to focus investment to make them more efficient, to reduce cost, to expand them, and to move away from existing energy use. In Japan, the debate on how to integrate the variable renewables into the market is still ongoing. The argument that the same amount of thermal power needs for adjustment for the expansion of variable renewables, or that blackouts will occur without base load power sources, such as nuclear and thermal. We first need to move away from the idea that the traditional electricity rationing system and relative trading are stable and secure. The 2050 long-term strategy currently being under discussion by the government assumes that Japan will continue to use three types of energy: renewables, nuclear power, and fossil fuel, as you mentioned. While renewables will be the main source of energy, new nuclear technology will be introduced. CCS and CCUS will be used with fossil generation, and hydrogen will be produced from fossil fuels and used to generate electricity. In our long-term scenario, the pathway to 100% renewable is laid out through least cost planning. Existing researches have shown that there is significant development potential in Japan for both solar and wind power, which could be supplied in large quantities as costs fall, and together with other renewable energy sources, 100% of electricity will be supplied by renewables. Thermal and nuclear power will not be economically viable to use after 2035, and using CCS will be even more costly, and it will be extremely difficult to secure storage sites for the captured CO2. In addition, nuclear power will only be able to provide at most 4 to 5%, we assume, of the electricity needed in 2050. Even if all reactors are restarted, their operation is extended to 60 years, and high capacity factors rates are maintained. A strategy that relies on these technologies to decarbonize Japan is unrealistic. The total cost of energy in 2050 will be 29% lower than in 2020 due to lower fossil fuel import costs, progress in energy efficiency, and lower renewable energy costs. Energy self-sufficiency will improve significantly from 12% to 68% in our scenario. Japan needs to bring down the current cost of renewables from double to triple that of other countries to global standards. This will require policy innovation, including the creation of markets that prioritize renewables over existing conventional energy sources and effective emission controls on coal. As I mentioned, the government is discussing the energy mix for 2030 and long-term strategy for 2050, preparing for the G7. With the publication of our scenarios and the presentation to the Government Council, 100% renewable is now being considered by the government as one of the scenario options. However, an interim report published last week calculated that the 100% renewable scenario would cost twice as much as conventional energy scenario. So I think that we are ready for the debate on this new government scenario, and we will raise that our opinions to stimulate the debate.
It's good to hear that scenarios and models play such an important role in the policy debate in Japan. Bruce, in a South African context, is there a consensus on the technologies that are needed going forward, or is there a lot of debate?
Yeah, so there's a fair amount of debate happening in South Africa still, and I think it can be pretty much summed up as largely a protection of interests debate for the most part, with the key technologies debate happening around whether or not South Africa should follow a path that chooses only one technology as the way forward versus something that embraces all fuel sources. So government's current policy is that there is space for various different energy technologies, and that no single technology or group of technologies needs to be in play. So in the plans, there is provision and pushes to include some level of new build coal, although incredibly small and unlikely to really influence anything. And some level of talk around nuclear generation is also part of the discussion, which is often being debated as to should we be doing nuclear, should we be doing additional coal. So there's certainly a clear difference in opinion on whether you need to optimize on a single technology. It seems to be unanimous in the view that renewables has an important role to play. So that the wind and solar technologies have already proven themselves to be the most cost-effective option we currently have available. So the rollout of renewables will likely go ahead. The difficulties in terms of a debate around technologies happen more in terms of, do we push for fuel cell vehicles or electric vehicles, and that's largely driven by the platinum industry in South Africa in terms of the role of platinum in fuel cells being something that is being considered. So there's not a clear policy view on whether or not we should be pushing for electric vehicles or fuel cell vehicles. It's currently not a major area of work in South Africa because I think we're still quite a long way off on the vehicle side, whether it's fuel cells or electric vehicles. But it is certainly something that it's not as simple as looking at what the models tell you is the best path forward. There's more to it than just simply looking at the scientific research and what's cheap or what will work best. There's certainly a lot of different interests and considerations that go past simply the economic modeling of the various technologies. So yeah, as it stands at the moment, onshore wind, solar PV are the two technologies that have come out as winners, and there's a lot of debate around the other technologies that may be used into the future.
Thank you very much for these insights. In an Indonesian context, there's, for example, also a lot of debate around biodiesel and with very ambitious numbers out there. Are there any other technologies that are currently being discussed, and what is your perspective on these solutions?
Yeah, that's right. This part of the government scenario is to increase the biofuel utilization, which is now the main feedstocks is actually palm oil, and the government has a target to increase the blending of the biodiesels from B30 right now into something like B40 in the next year, after 2025, and also aspire to have like B100s. Although we understand that the economics of biofuel is still in questions, but there is a kind of the subsidy mechanism that currently in place to cover that cost. But also the government plan to increase the electric vehicle, and that's currently the government plan to build the infrastructure, in particular the industries of electric vehicles is actually battery and also car manufacturing, but also at the same time start to increase the infrastructure for charging infrastructure. It will take it's not easy, transport sectors, and the government target, I think 20% of the vehicles sold by 2030 come from electric vehicles. So we still have to, I think, we would like to reach decarbonization by 2050. That effort has to be accelerated. So this number of electric vehicles has to increase from 2030 to 2050. But from the for the power sectors, the current discussions in terms of technology is that until 2035, the government plan to utilize all the renewable energy resources, and Indonesia is rich with various renewable energy. So we have geothermal, we have bioenergy, we have solar, wind, little bit wind, and hydro. So the government plan to utilize that, in particular look at the hydro and geothermal, which we have one of the largest geothermal resource in the world. And after 2035, the plan is also to utilize technology like hydrogen, which is currently still infant in Indonesia. Also nuclear, we see is the government projection that nuclear will increase dramatically after 2035, and I think that's part of the reason, because the government look at the current generation 4 or SMR nuclear technology that, according to government, is safer. But under current, our national energy policy stated that still stated that nuclear is the last option. So that's why I think in the government scenario, the nuclear will be added after 2035. And also CCUS, CCS and CCUS, and for oil and gas, I think, as well as coal gasification or coal to dimethyl ether. As I mentioned, the government plan to increase the coal utilization. So for producing dimethyl ether, and it will be supplemented with a technology like CCS. Of course, these two issues, cost issue and the economic issue, is still questions whether it is economic enough for Indonesia to have that technology a part of our energy system. That's actually in contrary with our models that shows that CCS and nuclear is actually not economically viable. So we base our current technology. So solar is the main technology in our system. I think around 80% of the energy mix by 2050 come from solar. Also storage technology, and given that the Indonesia is island archipelagic country, where the demand and supply for each islands not same, so we also have to increase the interconnection, inter-island interconnection, so we can transfer this supply from other island through another island. So that's part of the scenario. So in our model, we have shown that we actually doesn't need nuclear if we can utilize solar and storage. Of course, the discussion that currently have within the government and utility is that similar to Japan, is that we need baseload power. So that's why I think nuclear come into the equations. But I think we can prove, and current recent evidence shows that solutions like solar or variable renewable energy plus storage can actually provide similar capabilities like baseload power plant, something like that.
Thank you very much, Fabi, for these insights for Indonesia. So as a wrap-up, I think I can conclude that from a think tank perspective, that scenarios and models have a very important role to play in this discussion. Thank you very much for these insights, and I hand it back to Asani.
Thank you, Dolph. Thank you, Dolph, and all the speakers, Mika, Fabi, and Bruce, for the great discussion. We are about to conclude the event, and I actually wanted to give a very, very brief summary of the discussion. So there is a broad alignment of the ingredients of what net zero scenario would entail. And it includes, for example, the renewables were very important, electrification and end-use sectors, electrification of the end-use sectors and efficiency improvement. And different governments use scenarios as a key element to set the clear goals, help support the risk management, and to ensure wider policy consistencies. And international think tanks also use scenarios to challenge the government and to make sure the quality of the discussion is added. So thank you very much. It's very short conclusion. I would also just like to mention that on behalf of Irina and Agora Vende, thank you very much for all the speakers. And CEM LTS initiative is open to all CEM members, and we welcome any countries to share their experience and to join the initiative. Thank you very much. Goodbye.